The encrypted message that arrived at the Pentagon on a beautiful morning contained just 7 words: Operation Dragon's Den has been compromised. Within hours, emergency meetings were convened across Washington as intelligence analysts scrambled to understand how their most classified surveillance operation in the South China Sea had been exposed. The source of the leak wasn't a double agent or hacked communications. It was something far more embarrassing. Filipino fishermen equipped with smartphones had been live-streaming Chinese military movements to millions of viewers worldwide, turning what should have been secret territorial expansion into a global spectacle. This single incident would later be recognized as the moment when the balance of power in Southeast Asia shifted permanently, and the story of how it happened reveals one of the most extraordinary geopolitical transformations of our lifetime. Before we dive into this incredible chain of events that caught every major intelligence agency off guard, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to discover involves maritime chess moves, economic warfare, and diplomatic strategies so sophisticated they've rewritten the playbook for how smaller nations can outmaneuver superpowers. The transformation began not in government offices or military headquarters, but in the cramped cabin of a fishing boat called the Maria Cristina, operated by a 58-year-old captain named Eduardo Santos. For 3 generations, Santos' family had fished the waters around Scarborough Shoal, following routes his grandfather had taught him before the Second World War. But on that fateful morning in March 2023, Santos discovered something that would change everything. Massive Chinese dredging operations were destroying the coral reefs that had sustained his community for decades, and he had the mobile phone footage to prove it. What happened next nobody could have predicted. Instead of filing a complaint with local authorities or accepting compensation to stay quiet, Santos uploaded his videos to social media with a simple caption: "They're destroying our home, and the world needs to see." Within 24 hours, his footage had been viewed over 50 million times. International news networks picked up the story, environmental groups launched campaigns, and suddenly the eyes of the world were focused on a remote corner of the South China Sea that most people had never heard of. The Chinese response revealed everything about how Beijing had miscalculated Filipino resolve. Coast Guard vessels surrounded Santos' boat, but instead of intimidating him into silence, the confrontation was broadcast live on Facebook to an audience of over 100,000 viewers. When Chinese officials demanded he stop filming, Santos replied in words that would become a rallying cry across the Philippines: "These are our waters, our fish, our future. I will not be silenced by anyone." The image of a weathered fisherman standing up to a superpower's warships became an instant symbol of resistance that galvanized an entire nation. The first shocking development emerged from President Marcos Jr.'s response to the international attention. Rather than seeking quiet diplomatic solutions or accepting Chinese assurances about environmental protection, he made a decision that stunned foreign policy experts worldwide. Within a week of Santos' videos going viral, the Philippines announced the creation of the Transparent Seas Initiative, equipping every fishing vessel in disputed waters with satellite communication equipment and high-definition cameras. Filipino fishermen were officially transformed from passive victims into active intelligence gatherers, documenting every Chinese military movement in real time. The psychological impact on Chinese operations was immediate and devastating. Military personnel who had operated under cover of secrecy suddenly found their every move scrutinized by thousands of civilian observers. Construction schedules that depended on avoiding international attention were disrupted by constant surveillance. Most critically, the veil of legitimacy that Beijing had tried to maintain around its artificial island construction was permanently shattered. The world could now see exactly what China was building and how they were destroying the marine environment to do it. The second shocking development came through an economic strategy so subtle that most observers initially missed its significance. The Philippines began implementing what officials called reciprocal economic standards, requiring Chinese companies operating in Filipino waters to meet the same environmental and labor standards that Filipino companies faced when operating in China. The catch was that these standards were virtually impossible for foreign companies to meet without massive additional investments and operational changes. Chinese fishing fleets that had operated with impunity in Filipino waters suddenly found themselves subject to inspections, fines, and operational restrictions. Construction companies working on Chinese military installations discovered that their supply chains were being monitored for compliance with Filipino environmental regulations. Most surprisingly, Chinese telecommunications companies found their underwater cable projects subjected to security reviews that effectively blocked expansion of Beijing's digital influence in Southeast Asian waters. The beauty of this strategy was its perfect legality and apparent reasonableness. Every restriction could be justified as environmental protection or national security, making it impossible for China to retaliate without appearing to oppose reasonable regulatory standards. Yet the cumulative effect was to make Chinese operations in Filipino waters significantly more expensive and operationally complex than Beijing had ever anticipated. The third shocking development revealed the true sophistication of Filipino strategic planning. While international attention focused on maritime disputes, Manila was quietly revolutionizing its military partnerships in ways that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. The Philippines didn't just invite American forces back to bases they had left decades earlier, they created a new model of rotational sovereignty that allowed multiple allied nations to maintain simultaneous presence without permanently stationing foreign troops on Filipino soil. Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force personnel began conducting joint patrols with Filipino Coast Guard vessels. Australian surveillance aircraft started operating from Philippine bases on a rotating basis. South Korean naval vessels began making regular port calls for maintenance and resupply. Most remarkably, Indian naval experts arrived to provide training in submarine detection techniques. China suddenly found itself surrounded not by a single adversary, but by a coordinated network of democratic allies operating from Filipino territory. The fourth shocking development transformed the information warfare landscape in ways that caught Chinese propagandists completely unprepared. The Philippines launched what officials called radical transparency, live-streaming all interactions with Chinese vessels and making real-time data about territorial disputes available to anyone with an internet connection. When Chinese ships approached Filipino positions, the world could watch the confrontation unfold in high definition with full audio. This approach neutralized China's sophisticated disinformation campaigns while turning every territorial incident into a global teaching moment about international law. Chinese officials who had grown accustomed to controlling narratives through state media suddenly found themselves trying to explain their actions to international audiences who could see exactly what was happening. The psychological advantage shifted permanently to the Philippines, which could now present evidence rather than arguments. If you're as captivated by this strategic masterclass as I am, why not hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications? These are the kinds of stories that reveal how the world really works, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The fifth shocking development came through cultural warfare disguised as tourism promotion. The Philippines began aggressively marketing the disputed territories as ecotourism destinations, bringing international visitors to see both the natural beauty of the South China Sea and the environmental destruction caused by Chinese military construction. Tour operators offered sovereignty cruises that took visitors to the exact locations where territorial disputes were playing out. The genius of this approach was that it made territorial disputes tangible and personal for international visitors. Instead of abstract legal arguments about maritime boundaries, tourists could see destroyed coral reefs, militarized artificial islands, and the impact on local fishing communities. Photography and social media posts from these tours generated millions of additional impressions, turning tourism into a form of soft power projection that was both profitable and politically effective. Chinese attempts to discourage this tourism through diplomatic pressure only generated more international attention and sympathy for Filipino positions. When Beijing complained that tourism in disputed areas was provocative, Manila responded that showing visitors their own territory could hardly be considered aggressive behavior. The contrast between Chinese secrecy and Filipino transparency became increasingly stark. The sixth shocking development revolutionized regional maritime security through technological innovation that nobody saw coming. The Philippines partnered with private technology companies to develop the world's most advanced civilian maritime monitoring system, using artificial intelligence to analyze satellite imagery and predict Chinese military movements with unprecedented accuracy. This system was then shared freely with other Southeast Asian nations, creating a regional early warning network that operated independently of major power intelligence services. Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei could now track Chinese activities in their own waters using Filipino-developed technology. The Philippines had essentially democratized maritime surveillance, removing the monopoly that superpowers had traditionally held over strategic intelligence. The technological breakthrough extended beyond monitoring to active deterrence. Filipino engineers developed underwater sensors that could detect submarine movements and transmit alerts to surface vessels and aircraft. These sensors were deliberately designed to be inexpensive and easy to deploy, allowing them to create comprehensive coverage of disputed waters without massive financial investments. The seventh shocking development emerged from what experts now call the archipelago advantage. The Philippines used its unique geography, consisting of over 7,000 islands, to create a network of mutually supporting positions that made Chinese military operations exponentially more complex. Every island became a potential monitoring post, supply depot, or launching point for defensive operations. This distributed defense strategy made it impossible for China to secure control over Filipino waters without simultaneously occupying hundreds of separate locations. The logistical challenges were insurmountable, while the political costs of such massive military action would have been catastrophic for Chinese international relations. Beijing found itself checkmated by geography and strategic planning. The Philippines also leveraged its overseas Filipino worker diaspora, the largest in the world, as an informal intelligence and diplomatic network. Filipino workers in every major global city became unofficial ambassadors for their country's territorial claims, generating grassroots international support that traditional diplomacy could never achieve. The eighth and most shocking development came through economic jiu-jitsu that turned Chinese financial leverage against itself. The Philippines began requiring Chinese companies to post environmental bonds for any operations in disputed waters, with the bond amounts calculated based on the full environmental restoration costs if damage occurred. These bonds were so substantial that they effectively priced Chinese companies out of the most sensitive areas. Simultaneously, Manila offered preferential terms to companies from democratic allies, creating economic incentives for international businesses to support Filipino positions. Japanese companies received tax breaks for environmentally sustainable operations. American firms got streamlined permitting for renewable energy projects. European investors found red carpet treatment for infrastructure developments that supported Filipino sovereignty. The cumulative effect was to make Filipino waters increasingly expensive for Chinese operations while increasingly profitable for allied companies. Economic incentives aligned perfectly with geopolitical objectives, creating a self-reinforcing system that strengthened Filipino positions while weakening Chinese influence. The transformation reaches its dramatic conclusion in today's reality, where Chinese military installations that once symbolized unstoppable expansion now appear increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Filipino fishermen operate freely in waters they had been excluded from for years, protected by international law and backed by real-time surveillance systems. Chinese economic projects face unprecedented scrutiny and competition from alternative partners who offer better terms and greater respect for Filipino sovereignty. Most remarkably, the Philippines has achieved what political scientists call deterrence through transparency. Chinese aggression that might have succeeded under the cover of secrecy becomes impossible when conducted under global scrutiny. Every hostile action generates immediate international attention and diplomatic consequences, while Filipino responses appear reasonable and proportionate to worldwide audiences. You've witnessed one of the most sophisticated displays of strategic thinking in modern international relations, and if you're craving more stories that reveal the hidden dynamics shaping our world, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on because we regularly uncover the forces that mainstream media misses entirely. The Philippines today stands as the undisputed leader of Southeast Asia not through military conquest or economic domination, but through moral authority earned by standing up to bullying while respecting international law. They've proven that in the modern world, transparency can triumph over secrecy, coalition building can overcome individual strength, and democratic values can defeat authoritarian pressure when properly defended. China's attempt to intimidate a smaller neighbor into submission has instead created a regional power whose influence extends far beyond its physical size, and whose example continues to inspire democratic movements worldwide. The fisherman's smartphone that started this revolution continues to broadcast from the South China Sea, a permanent reminder that in an interconnected world, even superpowers cannot act in darkness indefinitely.